The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.
Over the weekend, our president basically admitted what many Americans have thought for a long time, which is that he wasn't really ready nor qualified to be president of the United States. Trump did an interview with Reuters a few days ago. The entire thing was about as delusional as that Associated Press interview from last week. Let's take a look at a couple different pieces of it. Here's Donald Trump saying, quote, "I loved my previous life. I had so many things going. This is more work than in my previous life. I thought it would be easier. I thought it would be easier to be president of the United States." In other words, I didn't know what the job entailed. And it's shocking that being president of the United States would be more work than real estate, right? Or I guess the last 10 years have mostly been being a reality show host and putting your name on buildings. And also, this is more work than Trump was doing before. He's playing golf every 9 days. How much more work is he doing now than before if this is more work? But anyway, here we get to the really delusional part of this interview. Quote, "I thought it was more of a, I'm a details-oriented person. I think you'd say that, but I do miss my old life. I like to work, so that's not a problem. But this is actually more work." He says he's a detail-oriented person. He released a tax plan which would represent a massive total overhaul as a single page of bullet points. And it didn't even explain, Pat, what the income limits were for each of the 3 tax brackets he proposed. The first bullet point is grow the economy and create millions of jobs. On what planet is this guy detail-oriented?
And just the fact that he didn't realize that the presidency is perhaps the hardest job in the entire world because there's so much pressure on you. And ideally, you should be working around the clock in that role. It kind of reminds me of a few weeks ago when the Republican healthcare bill was being debated, and he said that no one knew healthcare could be so complicated. Everyone knows that healthcare is complicated. Everyone knows that the presidency is a hard job.
Yeah, it seems it's mostly Trump who doesn't know these obvious truths. And again, detail-oriented. Whenever Trump is asked any question by reporters, the guy can't go 2 sentences before interrupting himself. Americans, by and large, agree that Donald Trump is not qualified to be president of the United States. And Trump is sort of, in a way, coming around to that. Many polls told us this all election long. We had a Washington Post ABC News poll which came out, which showed us that, by and large, Americans thought throughout 2015 and 2016 that Trump wasn't qualified to be president. We had a CBS News poll from 2016, which again showed that a majority of Americans did not think that Donald Trump was qualified to be president. And the details show more of the delusions that Donald Trump has here. In the middle of his interview with Reuters, Trump passed out copies of a map he had on hand. Was this a map of his foreign policy strategy? Was this a map of the broader strategy in Syria? No, Donald Trump handed out a map during this Reuters interview, which was colored in with the results of the 2016 election, saying to the Reuters team, it's pretty good, right? Yeah. This guy is so obsessed with the election results that he keeps printouts of the results map around to show visitors. We're dealing with a child here. And here's the best way, I think, to sum it up, Pat. Trump's goal was never to be president. It was to win the presidential election. We're learning now how major the differences are between those two things. Trump wanted the trophy, not the job. And that's why he's keeping around the election maps. You don't actually get a trophy when you win the presidential election. And the closest thing is these maps that Trump is handing to people.
I think that just given Donald Trump's skill set, it was a lot easier for him to be a campaigner, to speak in front of large crowds, to downplay people like Lying Ted and Crooked Hillary. But now that he's in a position where he actually has to be detail-oriented and be a good president, it's a much more challenging task for him.
Yeah, it's not nearly as fun. And I would blame Obama, actually. I mean, Obama should have campaigned harder for Hillary Clinton in the Rust Belt so that people would realize Trump wasn't ready. As with everything else, I think that we have a really solid case here to blame former President Barack Obama. Let's talk a little bit about Donald Trump and his taxes and the tax plan, okay? Context. The tax plan of Donald Trump so far is a single sheet of paper with something like a dozen bullet points on it. By the way, with one of the weirdest combinations of fonts I've seen in a very, very long time. There's no detail whatsoever. If this was a real plan, each of the bullet points on Donald Trump's, quote, tax plan would require pages of explanation and analysis and data on implementation. And even that would just be a summary of really complex underlying details. I'm unsure if Donald Trump has ever had more lies per minute than in the clip I'm about to play for you. I'm thinking of that non-State of the Union address that he gave, where he stated about one lie per minute. Listen to what Donald Trump says in this clip.
We're the highest tax nation in the world. Our business taxes are through the roof, and we're not competitive, and companies are leaving.
Okay, so the reality is none of that is true, okay? Number one, even in terms of the rate, the corporate tax rate, the U.S. is not the highest in the world. You've got Cameroon and Angola, Argentina, Bangladesh, Benin, Burundi, Gabon, Pakistan, Zambia. They have the same or higher tax rate on paper. But that doesn't matter, because the key point, and we've talked about this, Pat, is the effective tax rate on corporations. It's very low in the United States due to deductions, loopholes, and offshoring. What does it matter that the corporate tax rate is on paper 35% when companies can pay no or actually pay negative corporate taxes using all of the offshoring techniques and loopholes, et cetera, that have seen so many companies pay nothing? So right away, Trump is just lying. That was 9 seconds, and I think he told 2 lies there, okay? Let's continue on to the biggest beneficiaries of Donald Trump's proposed tax plan.
We're going to bring companies back. We're going to lower taxes. And the biggest beneficiaries are the small companies. And the biggest of all beneficiaries are middle-income people.
Wrong. The biggest beneficiaries by percentage and by dollar amount are going to be the very rich, period. But here's the real key part, okay? Here's the focus. What about how Donald Trump's own tax plan will influence the taxes that he pays? Take a listen to this.
Middle-class people who have been absolutely hurt.
But your critics are going to say, well, real estate companies like President Trump's company will benefit along with that middle class. So is it going to make it harder for you to get that big cut in the middle from 39.6 to 15?
Okay, if I'm individually paying 35%, I will tell you that's more. Okay, I'm going to end up paying more than I pay right now in taxes, all right? I will pay more than I pay right now. The reason I'm going to pay more is because I lose all the deductions. They have deductions on top of deductions. They have hundreds and hundreds of pages of deductions.
Those, and
things that you've never heard of before. I have great accounting firms. I'm sure you do. They come in, well, you're entitled to a deduction for geese flying over America. You're entitled to this. You're entitled to... By the time they give you all these stuff, all of that stuff goes away. All of it goes away, other than charitable deductions, which we think is important to keep, and interest deductions, which we think is important to keep. But all of this stuff goes away. Yeah. So I predict I will probably pay more than I'm paying right now.
The one thing we did learn from Rachel Maddow's making a huge deal out of the 2 pages of Trump's 2005 taxes was that most of the taxes Trump paid were because of something called the alternative minimum tax, which Trump is going to get rid of in this new tax plan. The rate game he's playing here is irrelevant because most of Trump's taxes are paid because of the alternative minimum tax. So he can get rid of deductions, Pat, like he says he will. But the truth is, if you get rid of the AMT, his taxes go way down.
And just listening to that interview, it's almost as if he's admitting that he should be paying more in taxes and that it's unjust that the richest of the rich pay such a small rate. And that rate should be higher, maybe not the 90% that it was under Dwight D. Eisenhower, but anywhere up to 50%, it should be raised.
And again, we're talking about a marginal tax rate. That doesn't mean you pay 50% on all your income, just the income above a certain amount. So this is a lie, what Trump is saying here. But consider something else. Trump predicts he will probably pay more. It's his tax plan, and he doesn't know how it will affect him. Seriously, Trump supporters, how much more do you need to hear? If he released his taxes, we could know for sure. The major revelation is that the plan is not really a plan. It's bullet points, each of which needs to be fleshed out to really be called a plan. If you took that plan, that single page, to the Congressional Budget Office and said, give us a cost analysis on this, they'd have very little to actually analyze.
And I thought that Trump was such an effective leader. You'd think he'd be on top of these certain things, but it just sounds as if he's delegating out all the responsibility, and the people taking over these legislative agendas are the people in the establishment.
And please, do not fall for the simplicity is objectively better thing, okay? Republicans like to say simplicity is key. It was used with Obamacare when Republicans would put a stack of 2,000 sheets of paper on a table next to their lectern and say, Obamacare is bad because look at how many pages it is. And Sean Spicer tried this as well. He brought out a small stack of papers versus a big stack. And he basically said the big stack is the Democrats, the small stack is our plan. So our plan is better merely because it's fewer pages. Simple and complex regulations both can be good or bad. It depends on whether they're thought out or not, on whether they're debilitating or not. The number of pages is not relevant, and the supposed small government crowd is objectively always thinking, hey, fewer pages means it's definitely better. That's not always the case, and you've got to break out of that paradigm.
Yeah, it's really such a weak argument. And the fact that they wanted to take over the whole healthcare industry with a bill that was 66 pages long, it just goes to show that they don't really know what they're doing.
Send me your thoughts about this. I'm on Reddit at I'm on Twitter at DPacman. The show is on Twitter at David Pakman Show. We'll be back right after this.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com. The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.
Today's new member of the day is Christian Lung. Thank you so much, Christian, for signing up at davidpakman.com/membership. This is viewer and listener supported media. You can sign up for membership at davidpakman.com/membership. We do have a coupon code available, I voted 17. It'll give you a nice little discount. You can make a pledge at patreon.com/davidpakmanshow. Even $1 a month helps to support the work that we do. And of course, if you ever shop on Amazon.com, type in davidpakman.com/Amazon into your browser, and any of the shopping you do will send us a little bit of a kickback and support the work that we are doing. Okay, we've been talking off and on about being about 100 days into the Donald Trump administration. We've talked about the historically low approval ratings that we've seen from Donald Trump. And it's been scandal after scandal, right? The Russian collusion scandal, multiple law enforcement investigations, 2 failed Muslim-majority immigration bans. We've had the failed sanctuary city order. We've had the failed repeal and replacement of Obamacare. It's a long list. I'll stop there. And in an interview with Fox News, Donald Trump is blaming the checks and balances that are constitutionally supported, that our government has in place for his failures. What? Checks and balances have stopped Trump from getting done what he wanted to get done? Well, maybe there's something to it. Let's take a listen to what Donnie Boy had to say.
Over the years, you know, your views just change somewhat, but I think more than anything else, I'm a person of common sense. I understand what has to be done. I get things done. I've always been a closer. We don't have a lot of closers in politics, and I understand why. It's a very rough system. It's an archaic system. You look at the rules of the Senate, even the rules of the House, but the rules of the Senate and some of the things you have to go through, it's really a bad thing for the country, in my opinion. They are archaic rules, and maybe at some point we're going to have to take those rules on, because for the good of the nation, things are going to have to be different. You can't go through a process like this. It's not fair. It forces you to make bad decisions. I mean, you're really forced into doing things.
It's just not fair, Pat. All those pesky laws, rules, and regulations are getting in Donald Trump's way. The things a president has to go through to get his way whenever he wants are bad for the country, and the rules should be changed.
Is it possible, though, that he's not talking so much about the Constitution and the systems of checks and balances as he is just kind of these quirky Senate traditions? So, for example, when Mitch McConnell got Elizabeth Warren to sit down by invoking Rule 13, or the fact that the Republicans had to use a budget reconciliation bill to try to push their health care act because that was they were able to avoid a filibuster that way.
I mean, yeah, I get what you're saying. I understand what you're saying. But if you actually do a fair analysis of it, Trump has probably benefited from some of those rules in the sense that, Neil Gorsuch should not even have been confirmed. The Republicans in the Senate went in and changed the rules in order to get Trump his way. This is sort of the main part of the presidential oath of office, which is you're preserving, protecting, and defending the Constitution, which includes checks and balances, which includes the rules of the Senate, the rules of the House, and now these are an impediment to Trump doing whatever on earth he wants. So is he directly attacking the Constitution? No, I think you're right about that. He's not saying abolish the Constitution. But it's more the idea that this is how Trump runs his businesses, right? Or ran his businesses. Well, maybe he's still running them. I guess we're not really sure. Which is he gets his way. What he says goes. He told us that's the way he would run the country. The only thing more absurd than Trump saying this is his bamboozled supporters, the constitutional fetishists, who don't even seem to care that he's saying checks and balances are getting in the way and we should reduce them. This is almost impossible to parody. It's a real problem for comedy writers and satirical shows because you can't really do a satirical version of this. And if you want to focus on archaic parts of how our government functions, let's change the archaic Electoral College as well as gerrymandering, both of which helped Trump and Republicans come to power. In a sense, he's right. You've got to give him credit. If it weren't for the checks and balances of our system, his Muslim travel bans would probably be in place. His sanctuary city order would be in place. His Abortive American Health Care Act would be in place. It would all have gone through. So in a sense, he's right, and we have that to thank.
And although he'll claim that he has great respect for the Constitution, this is a guy that maybe has never even read the document.
Maybe.
It's 6 pages long and on regular sheets of paper. It's a quick read. And Trump also mentioned that the Constitution has 12 articles or so.
Yeah.
It actually only has 7.
Well, I don't think anyone is shocked.
Right.
But listen, he is not a details guy. He's a big picture guy. Oh, wait a second. Over the weekend, he said in that Reuters interview, he is a details guy. Well, I don't know. I can't explain why he doesn't seem to know any of the details on this. But I guess he's just not happy with the fact that he can't do whatever it is that he wants to do. Nationalism and globalism. Okay, we've talked about nationalism and globalism. We've talked about issues going on our planet currently that don't lend themselves to nationalist solutions. We'll get to that again a little bit later in the segment. But the context is that Donald Trump has been acutely anti-globalist. Anti-globalist. He's been a nationalist. Nationalists typically want protectionist economic policies, tariffs, border walls, etc. Globalists tend to be more supportive of free movement of people, free movement of capital, free trade, less strict immigration policies, no border walls. Looking at Trump's policy ideas over the campaign, it's been pretty clear where he stands. He wants a border wall. He's a nationalist. Get out of NAFTA. He backed out on that. He wants to, he's talked negatively about the global power structure that robs our working class. That's all nationalist rhetoric. But lately, there have been some splits on the globalism, nationalism issue. Steve Bannon and Trump's wacky spokesperson, Stephen Miller, are more on the nationalist side. But then you've got people like Jared Kushner and Reince Priebus who are more globalist in their thinking. So Trump was asked about that split in an interview with the Wall Street Journal a few days ago. And Trump basically dismissed the idea with something that I've read it must be 50 times now, Pat, and I can't figure it out. Trump said, hey, I'm a nationalist and a globalist. I'm both. And I'm the only one who makes the decision, believe me. Is this some kind of record, like a 180-degree flip-flop in the same sentence within 2 words of each other?
I just don't think that he realizes some things are mutually exclusive. So, for example, you can't be a communist and a laissez-faire capitalist at the same time. You can't be authoritarian and libertarian. This is one of those things.
Or can you be both? Apparently, in Trump's mind, you can. I don't know. Does anybody think that Trump just doesn't really understand the meaning of either globalist or nationalist? I mean, that's probably the simplest explanation here. Because what I'm hearing when Trump says I'm both a nationalist and a globalist is I don't really know what either term means for my politics. and I'd rather not commit to anything in particular. So I'll just say I'm both and hopefully appeal to everybody.
And remember when flip-flopping used to take a candidate down? So, for example, Mitt Romney and John Kerry probably lost their respective races because they changed their mind on these issues. Trump does it with every single issue down the board.
Yeah, there's no issue where Trump has really been totally consistent. You know that silly phrase? It's something like, it's a riddle wrapped in a mystery inside of an enigma or something like that. Have you ever heard that before?
Yes.
This from Trump is ignorance wrapped in confusion within delusions of grandeur. That's how I would summarize. I'm both a globalist and a nationalist.
It's kind of getting to a point where the irony and the contradictions kind of lose their effect because that is what is expected at this point, right?
The term globalism goes back to the 40s. Do you think Trump knows that? No. The term nationalism as a concept goes back further, about the late 1700s onward, ranging across many countries. When we talk about an issue like climate change, and I've said this before, we're not going to find a nationalist solution to climate change. Pollution does not respect imaginary lines drawn on a map. We need globalist solutions. And I'm not talking about globalist in the sense of Alex Jones, you know, globalist. I'm talking about just a globalist solution that spans more than one country. Unemployment, technological unemployment, and automation. We need a globalist solution, not globalist in the sense of a new world order, one world government, the likes of which you would hear on InfoWars, but one in which Trump can't act unilaterally to solve that problem. And I think that this is just a fundamental problem. It goes beyond Trump specifically. This is just a fundamental problem with the types of solutions, most of which aren't actually solutions, that we've heard proposed from Donald Trump. Since disgraced Trump National Security Advisor Michael Flynn was forced to resign from the Trump administration for lying about his communications with Russia, we've found out that he was also lobbying on behalf of Turkey, didn't tell the State Department. And after all of this came out, you may have been asking yourself, how is it possible that the Trump team didn't know about this? Why didn't they vet Michael Flynn? Multiple people in the Trump administration have been asked about this, and they said, we just didn't know. As it turns out, they did know. Both the White House and the Trump transition team did a background check on Flynn after Trump was elected. They found out about Flynn's ties to Turkey, and they still appointed him National Security Advisor. NBC News reported this on Friday night, saying they got the information from sources close to the Trump-Russia investigation. This suggests either that the Trump team didn't think that Flynn's foreign ties were a big deal, or they didn't think that anybody would find out. And just when I thought we had already hit rock bottom on the blame Obama for everything thing, Trump and other White House officials have now been going around recently emphasizing that it was actually Obama's administration that originally gave Flynn his security clearance. So, you know, I guess it's Obama's fault for all this. Take a look at this clip.
The most recent one comes back to Mike Flynn, who, when he left, when he resigned, you said that he was treated horribly and that you felt badly about that. Given what we now are seeing on the payments from Turkey and Russia, would you stand by that comment?
Well, let me just tell you, I do feel badly for him. He served the country. He was a general. But just remember, he was approved by the Obama administration at the highest level. And when they say we didn't vet, well, Obama, I guess, didn't vet, because he was approved at the highest level of security by the Obama administration.
This entire argument of, oh, the Flynn stuff is Obama's fault, it's all predicated on the notion that the Trump team didn't know about Flynn's connections and Obama should have known. We have now learned that the Trump team did know about Flynn's connections. So all of this blame Obama stuff about Flynn, it's even more deceptive than we thought now that we know the Trump team has been lying all along about what they knew about Flynn.
That's exactly right. And I also just think that the Trump team thought that they could get away with this because advisors don't have to go to the Senate for confirmation.
Right.
So, you know, like if Steve Bannon was appointed to a position that required Senate confirmation, there's no way that given his past, he would have been confirmed. Michael Flynn, the same thing. I think, you know, that scandal also started within the administration itself.
Yeah, the blame Obama scapegoat is almost always nonsense, but this time they've actually been caught red-handed, knowing exactly what was going on with Flynn, and then they try to blame Obama for it anyway. And by the way, Obama fired Flynn. I'm actually thinking about extreme vetting Is anybody else worried that the administration of extreme vetting either failed to properly vet or vetted and ignored the results of someone at the most sensitive national security level? This could be really bad for the Trump administration if and when all the facts on the Russia investigation come out. But when I hear Trump talk about extreme vetting and we think about the Flynn thing, I'm certainly not confident, Pat, that extreme vetting is going to be the forte of the Trump administration.
Right. It starts at the top, right? If you can't do extreme vetting for the people that are working in your inner circle, you can't do it for the rest of the country.
Absolutely. And the next frontier on Flynn is that last week, the House Oversight Committee said Flynn might have actually broken the law by doing business with Russia and Turkey without having told the military or the State Department. He may have even been told not to do so beforehand. So it's really not looking good for Flynn. The only question that remains for me is whether the Trump administration will be able to successfully sort of compartmentalize the Flynn thing and pretend that it doesn't touch any other aspect of the Trump administration. Remains to be seen. You can talk about this with our viewers and listeners on our Reddit discussion forum at davidpakman.com/REDDIT.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com. Welcome back to the David Pakman Show.
It's great to be joined today by Brian Klaas, who's a fellow in global and comparative politics at the London School of Economics, also author of the book, The Despot's Accomplice, How the West is Aiding and Abetting the Decline of Democracy. It's so great to have you on. You know, I think as a sort of general principle, we would consider that at the world level, we've seen more democracy since the Cold War. And you argue in the book that we've now seen a reversal in that. So I guess the first question is, how do we measure democracy in the world?
Sure, that's a good question. So you're absolutely right. We had a massive surge in democracy through the 1980s, 90s, and early 2000s. So Latin America democratized in the 80s. Then we had Eastern Europe and Sub-Saharan Africa in the 90s after the Berlin Wall fell. And then it started to switch. And this tipping point happened in around 2006, according to the major indices. This doesn't happen always with, coups or civil wars or, massive authoritarian grabs of power. It's a slippage of what a lot of political scientists call democratic backsliding. But basically, there's a lot of indicators that look at the quality of democracy. And the harsh reality is that for 11 years, we've been going in the wrong direction. So authoritarianism is on the march, and democracy is in retreat.
And what are some of the, generally, we've talked a lot about authoritarianism, certainly in the last year to year and a half, but what are some of the more specific indicators if we were to sort of create some kind of democracy score or
Sure.
mean or something like that? What sort of specifics can we look at?
So election quality is certainly one of them, how free and fair elections are. There's also press freedom. There's other aspects about how basically civil society is treated, how democratic the process of the rule of law is in making laws. There's a whole variety of them. There's a few different indices. Polity4 does one, Freedom House does another. There's one called Varieties of Democracy that's a think tank in Sweden. So, there's a variety of different ways of measuring it, but the unifying thread of all of these different measurements is they're seeing the same trend. This doesn't mean the democratic sky is falling. So, more people live in democracy in human history now, basically, than any other time, except for the peak about a decade ago. So we're still doing relatively well by historic standards in the long trend, but we are looking at a consistent and very troubling decline. And I'm worried that right now, with policy changes that are happening, sweeping around the world, that decline is actually getting worse before it gets better.
Are there, or is there a place, I guess, is the question, when we think about democracy, for factors such as income inequality, for example, or economic mobility, right? The idea of how easily can one move out of poverty if they are born into poverty, for example. Are those factors that have a role to play in thinking about democracy around the world?
Yeah, so if you think about the actual word democracy, it comes from two Greek words, demos and kratos. And I think what you're referring to is usually lumped into the kratos. So the demos is the people, the rule of the people. And the kratos is the power. And this is where, democracy itself is only good insofar as it actually generates results for people. So I say very clearly in the book, and I don't think this is a terribly controversial statement, but it's one you don't think about all that often, is you'd probably not rather be born in Benin in West Africa, even though it's a democratic state, compared to Singapore, which is an authoritarian state. Because you'd have to basically work for 65 years in Benin in order to receive the same salary you probably would get in Singapore. And at some point, the right to vote is not worth that much to a lot of people. So I think what a lot of people have lost track of is that democracy can be a moral and basic good no matter what, because it's important to have people have a say in their government, but it also has to deliver. And I think one thing that's hollowed out the quality of democracy in the West that has given rise to populism is a lot of people living in democratic states have seen their wages stagnate. They haven't been able to get ahead. And they're starting to turn to alternative models or alternative ways of thinking. And I think that's a mistake, even though I think it's also a wake-up call that we need to reinvigorate the quality of our democracy.
As far as populism is concerned, we've talked a lot on the program about how you can have sort of similar sounding populist rhetoric from potential or actual elected officials, but that in terms of governance, there's a pretty big difference between what we've sort of called progressive populism versus regressive populism. Can you talk a little bit about how the populist message more broadly cannot always directly relate to whether we're going to see an increase or decrease in democracy, or sort of how populist rhetoric can maybe muddy the waters in some sense?
Yeah, so I mean, a lot of the surge in populism around the world, if we look outside of the West, the sort of stereotypical cases of, the rise of populism in France right now or in the US, around the world, you typically have illiberal populism. So this is where, you have echoes of this in the West in the sense of Donald Trump's message of I alone can fix it is sort of an illiberal populist message. It's blending authoritarian rhetoric along with this idea that the little guy needs somebody else to look out for them. I mean, the irony of all this is that very often the standard bearers of populism are the ones who take advantage of inequality to ride to political office and then make political and economic inequality worse once they get there. And that's what's happening in the US right now. And I would argue will probably accelerate under, for example, Trump's tax plan. But, the aspect that I think was the really big missed opportunity is that there is a genuine possibility for people in the left, the center left, et cetera, to say, we messed up. We have basically ignored the center of our country, the center of our economy for 30 years. We haven't done enough to blunt the sharp edges of globalization, but we're going to do this in a way that is about, bridges rather than walls. It's about trying to actually create strategies to fix the problems rather than just simply demonize people and blame them for them. So, I think that's the real missed opportunity that's happened in the West. And that's something that's very dangerous because the more people believe that all politics is bad, and that's part of what the populist message is, the more that they turn to figures who are simply opportunists. And I think that's what we're seeing in a lot of places where, scapegoating is not actually a strategy. And when people begin to realize that robots and automation are a much bigger threat to them than China or Mexico or immigrants or whatever it is, they need somebody to pick up the pieces. And I'm hoping that, as the sort of tide switches back towards the adults, so to speak, the people who have skills and qualifications, there needs to be somebody ready to pick up that mantle who can speak the populist language, but also have a pragmatic strategy.
Brian, as far as religion is concerned, not in a sort of abstract way, but specifically as we've seen it applied around the world since the Cold War, can we make a general assessment about whether religion is currently a pro or anti-democratic influence in the world?
Yeah, I mean, it's very mixed, I would say. I think that religion has been exploited for authoritarian reasons sometimes, but very often in history, remember, some of the most tyrannical governments are completely secular and actually used the tools of the state to dismantle religion. I think, it's somewhat neutral to a sense. It depends on how it's used and how it's sort of, employed in pursuit of a specific ideology. But I would say that there is a trend. I mean, this has been identified for a long time. There's a famous article in Political Science called Mick world versus jihad, and this idea of, are we going to be this big global force which has maybe less room for religious local government, for example, or are we going to have sort of these village-based politics, tribal politics, and feeling like we can only look out for ourselves and not for the other? And religion certainly comes into that divide. So, I think that there's certainly a place for religion in the modern world, as long as it is not simply used to divide people. And what I think is really dangerous is when you have, in a liberal populist message, an authoritarian, wrapped up in authoritarian rhetoric, that then uses religion as a tool or a weapon. So, I don't think it's anything that's innately good or bad. I think it just depends on how people exploit it or choose to work along the lines of those values that people hold.
In thinking about American foreign policy for a second, there are those in the United States who have more interventionist leanings. And part of that is based around this idea of spreading democracy. We heard that from the George W. Bush administration, for example. Is there any way we can assess whether Western efforts to, quote, spread democracy actually have a pro-democratic influence sort of in the net?
Sure. So one of the chapters in the book is, it very explicitly says, no more democracy wars, right? So first off, I think we need to make really clear that trying to spread democracy by the barrel of the gun does not work, and is very often counterproductive. And what's even worse that a lot of people don't think about is this tipping point of the retreat of democracy in 2006, I think is very largely linked to the Iraq War and the fact that authoritarian regimes around the world were able to credibly claim that any sort of US pressure in support of human rights or pro-democracy NGOs on the ground or whatever was just a Trojan horse to prepare for regime change. And the Iraq War gave them that credibility because they could point to it and say, look, they did it elsewhere. So what ended up happening was all of a sudden these regimes around the world started purging NGOs, reformers, et cetera, and just saying this is the precursor to a CIA tactic or a US invasion. And of course it wasn't the case, but they had the legitimacy to say that because of the Iraq War. The second aspect of this is I think that there's a very big problem with how our foreign policy signals things abroad. And this is what I'm most worried about now. I think the US can actually legitimately spread democracy effectively if it does it right. But what's happening now is sort of a perfect storm of every bad thing the US could do. And what I mean by that is that, over the weekend, you had Trump inviting Rodrigo Duterte of the Philippines to the White House.
Right.
He embraced President Sisi of Egypt. He congratulated President Erdogan of Turkey on rigging a referendum that dismantled democracy within a NATO ally. And people around the world, one thing we don't think about all that often, but I saw, in my travels from Madagascar to Belarus, et cetera, was every regime around the world looks to Washington for cues about what it can get away with. And when you have those signals coming out of the White House, it is extremely counterproductive. And it sends the signal that the US just doesn't even care anymore. One of the things that I found striking was I went back through Trump's old tweets, and I found that he has tweeted, as of yesterday, he tweeted for the 247th time about crowds, right? He's tweeted about human rights once. And the only time he tweeted about them was to mock Secretary of State John Kerry for caring about them. So when you have that message, every government around the world sees that and thinks, if we torture a few journalists, I don't really think that's going to be a big deal to Trump. And they're probably right. So, I think that it takes a very smart strategy, which is, I outlined 10 principles for how the U.S. can be more effective in the book. But I think that we are going down a very dark path where the president is actually cheerleading these terrible governments as opposed to acting like a referee that can push them to follow the rules.
Well, the book is incredibly timely. Again, it's called The Despot's Accomplice, How the West is Aiding and Abetting the Decline of Democracy. We've been speaking with the book's author, Brian Klaas. Brian, thanks so much for talking to me today.
It's my pleasure. Thanks for having me on the show.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com. The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.
Donald Trump has been caught exaggerating again about the size of his crowds. I think most of us remember the day after Trump's inauguration. I crack myself up sometimes.
I thought you were going to go with hands.
Oh, no. Remember when Sean Spicer came to the lectern and blatantly lied about Trump having the largest inauguration crowd in history? This is the moment where Sean Spicer formally started destroying his political career.
The president took the oath of office. We know that 420,000 people used the D.C. Metro public transit yesterday, which actually compares to 317,000 that used it for President Obama's last inaugural. This was the largest audience to ever witness an inauguration, period.
Period. And then the same day, during his first full day as president, while standing in front of a CIA memorial for fallen officers, Trump also took that opportunity to inappropriately brag about the size of his crowd.
But we had a massive field of people. You saw that. Packed. I get up this morning, I turn on one of the networks, and they show an empty field. I said, wait a minute. I made a speech. I looked out. The field was, it looked like 1.5 million people. They showed a field where there were practically nobody standing there. We had, honestly, it looked like 1.5 million people, whatever it was. But it went all the way back to the Washington Monument. We had 250,000 people literally around, in the little bowl that we constructed. That was 250,000 people.
Yeah, so the truth is Trump had pretty low attendance at his inauguration, particularly compared to other presidents. He's clearly very insecure about that. Cut to Saturday in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania. Trump had another one of his bizarre post-election campaign rallies, which I'm still struggling to understand the point of. And what did Donald Trump talk about on Saturday? He said that the rally broke the all-time attendance record for the arena. Jonathan Tamari from the Philadelphia Inquirer tweeted these photos from the rally, saying, large and loud but not quite capacity crowd as Pence arrives, several rows open at top of arena and some space on the floor. Trump says we have a lot of people standing outside, and he broke the all-time record in this arena. There are rows of empty seats in here. You'd think that if this was the fullest event the arena had ever seen, it would be sold out, right? Well, Donald Trump had the following to say, quote, we really maxed out. We broke the all-time record for this arena. We broke the all-time record. Where do you suppose Trump got this supposed fact? Maybe out of thin air? Trump could have just said, hey, there's a huge crowd here today, and he would have been correct. But again, this just speaks to how regular and casual Donald Trump's lies are becoming, or really have been all along. This was happening during the White House Correspondents' Dinner, the dinner Trump refused to go to because he's not able to take a joke, because everybody knew that it was going to be brutal comedy against Donald Trump, and rightly so. This was probably Trump's insecurity once again shining through, don't you think?
And in addition to talking about crowd size, he's also starting the 2020 rhetoric already, going back to calling Elizabeth Warren Pocahontas. So you can tell that Donald Trump is the person that likes campaigning much more than he does being in office. There
was also a big crowd right across the street, a big protest happening against Donald Trump, endorsed by the mayor of Harrisburg, who also said, quote, I hope he will look around and understand that he needs to do more than rally his supporters. He needs to listen to and speak with those who didn't vote for him. That's Eric Pappenfuse, the mayor of Harrisburg, Pennsylvania. I would suggest that Mayor Pappenfuse not hold his breath. Lying about crowd size is sort of like a penis size contest of sorts. When the rubber meets the road, if you can't prove it, things are going to get awkward. At least that's how it's been in all the penis-sized contests I've witnessed. I don't know about you, Pat.
But actually, you know what? On that.
Yeah, it's better that you not comment on that. But anyway, Trump continuing to lie about the size of his crowds. Yesterday, in an interview on CBS's Face the Nation, the president again showered a dictator with praise. This time, it was North Korean dictator Kim Jong-un, referring to him as a, quote, smart cookie. Of course, Kim Jong-un is the tyrannical despot that runs North Korea with an iron fist through a cult of personality, forcing his people to worship him, constantly committing human rights abuses, running for the world's most oppressive tyrant. And here's Donald Trump commenting on Kim Jong-un.
I have no idea. I can tell you this, and a lot of people don't like when I say it, but He was a young man of 26 or 27 when he took over from his father, when his father died. He's dealing with obviously very tough people, in particular the generals and others. And at a very young age, he was able to assume power. A lot of people, I'm sure, tried to take that power away, whether it was his uncle or anybody else. And he was able to do it. So obviously, he's a pretty smart cookie.
He's a smart cookie because he was born into an autocratic dynasty where power is handed down from one generation to the next, from father to son. Kim Jong-un was next in line to take power over after Kim Jong-il died. That power was handed to him. And because of that, he's a smart cookie and tough and commendable, according to Donald Trump?
Yeah, Trump talks about Kim Jong-un as if he's a child of some sort. I think a few weeks ago he tweeted something to the effect that North Korea has to start behaving, and now he's a smart cookie. So, of course, you don't have to treat Kim Jong-un with any sort of respect, but if you're the president, you should probably be a little bit more diplomatic and not communicate via Twitter.
This is also insane, but it makes perfect sense because Trump is who he is because of the real estate empire and small loan of $1 million that his father gave him, right? Trump has to believe that Kim Jong-un deserves praise for what he got from his dad because Trump wants to believe the same thing about himself. If this doesn't convince Trump supporters that Trump is unbalanced, or at least that he has no ability whatsoever to think before he speaks, even when publicly talking about the antagonists of the United States, I don't know what will. And I'm not even saying that Kim Jong-un is stupid intellectually, but you don't have to be a genius to inherit power in a country that, under fear of death, has been taught to worship your family, right? That doesn't exactly take intelligence.
Yeah, it's certainly one of these things that these men both want to take credit for, but if you just win the genetic lottery and assume a lot of fortune or fame or, in Kim Jong-un's case, power, you don't really get much credit for that.
I completely agree. And there are other parallels between Trump and Kim Jong-un. Kim Jong-un is an entitled man-child with an incredible amount of unearned power who's blindly revered by his followers. That's pretty damn similar to Donald Trump. So I actually am not hugely surprised that Donald Trump sees Kim Jong-un and maybe sees a little bit of himself in Kim Jong-un's situation there. Send me your thoughts about this, because a lot of people are reacting to this in a way that seems to ignore the realities of Trump. And a lot of this makes perfect sense to me.
They both have ridiculous hairstyles.
That's another point.
That's a good similarity.
There are any number of similarities between Kim Jong-un and Donald Trump. We have a voicemail number. That number is 219-2-DAVID-P. Take a listen to this voicemail.
Hi, David. I was wondering if you ever just look at current events or see how things are being played out and just for whatever reason just lose faith in that people can do the right things. For example, stuff like climate change or healthcare in our country.
Yes. Yeah. I mean, the answer is yes. I find myself losing faith all the time.
No, don't give up, David. You got to keep the faith.
Yeah, people write in sometimes and they say, you got to keep going. But I think any person who's even remotely invested in the future of humanity would be a little bit disaffected right now, don't you think?
Well, yeah, it's one of those things, though, if you know you're screwed, do you just put on a good face for it, or do you just fess up to the reality of the situation?
Yeah, no, I know what you're saying. It's at a certain point, I think I told this story on the bonus show after our vacation. Very often during vacations, I'll sort of disconnect from what's going on politically. And the truth is that because our planet is pretty big, most individual things that happen are not going to affect you as an individual. And when we're paying attention to the news the way we do for the production of the show, it often feels like so much more of what's going on directly impacts our day-to-day. But the truth is, most of what goes on our planet does not impact our day-to-day. The future of climate change is obviously an exception to that. I'm not talking about that. And when I was on vacation and out of the country a couple of weeks ago, and deliberately not paying attention to what was going on, there's a certain, I understand the concept of ignorance is bliss.
Yes.
I completely understand it. And it often is easier on a day-to-day basis just not to even get wrapped up. Listen, if something happens in my immediate location, I'm going to know it and I'm going to deal with it. But there is something comforting about tuning it out every once in a while.
Sometimes it's nice to look at humanity from the outside and kind of disconnect yourself.
Yeah.
And the other point I would make is that I keep the faith when it comes to what the Republicans are doing and what Donald Trump is doing, because a lot of those things can be undone in the future. Unfortunately, climate change is one of those things that we can't really reverse.
Yes, it is. And there's probably other issues on that list, or at least that while they can be reversed, it takes a long time. A Supreme Court selection is an example, a lifetime appointment. On today's bonus show, we are going to talk about student loans that were designed to fail. We are going to talk about firefighting drones and other new drone applications. And I will tell you the story of my flight back from the conference in Las Vegas last week. Not a surprise to people who have been watching or listening to the show for a while. It was not the smoothest trip back from Las Vegas, which often is the case for me when it comes to air travel. So all of those stories and more on the bonus show, davidpakman.com/membership to sign up. I voted 17 as the coupon code, and patreon.com/davidpakmanshow to make a pledge. That's it. Make a pledge. I don't know what else to say. We'll talk to you on the bonus show.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.